Next up in the series, we're talking about edge, and this is going to be the separation of our major shapes on the skin. It's what gives us the ability to clearly see and understand what's going on, defining what is actually important in the artwork and what is not. So for the most part, people are going to use lines to create edge. Now, this isn't always the case with things like realism, but edges are going to be primarily the distinguishment between the artwork and the skin. So how do we separate those two things? And creating a line around our tattoos, it's a really easy way to create an edge. It acts like a fence that divides this side and that side so that we can easily understand whose lawn is whose, or who, maybe that's kind of a weird example. Let's take a look. Now we've got our rows that we were working on in the last example, and for the most part we've already created our edges by increasing the contrast around the major shapes. So we've actually already done this by putting in our darks and our lights in order to separate the major shapes that are going on here. So this would be my edge right here, separating the major petals from one another. And also separating, even more importantly, the skin, this area here, from my design. Now, the problem with this design is that you can see that my edges, they're not very dark. And what did we learn from the last lesson? If it's not very dark, if the value is not deep, then it's going to be easy for the body to eliminate it from the skin. So if our edges are not holding up very well, it's going to be very difficult to distinguish what the design actually is. So we have a problem here where these bits around the edge that act as a separation from my tattoo and the skin, for the most part, they're not very dark. It's pretty good around here, these areas with the shadow, but areas like this, and even like some of this stuff, this is not going to hold up very well. And I really want to try and amplify that contrast a little bit in order to create more longevity and readability in my design. So the easiest way to do this right now is to go through and just to apply a nice thick line around the outside. I'm doing this kind of fast and messy right now, but seriously, take your time when you're practicing this stuff. And in this example, since I've already created a lot of my major edges using contrast by pushing and pulling my shadows and my highlights, then I'm really just going to go through and I'm just going to create an edge around the outside here. That's all that I would say is really necessary for this piece in order to give it maximum longevity. Now, a lot of clients, they don't like this really bold look. So you just want to explain to them that if you don't go with the bold look, then it's not going to hold up that well over time. And a lot of people, they're okay with that, but it's another case where you want to know the rules before you break them. So look at that. If I zoom out a little bit, you can see that I have a really nice edge around my rows here. And this is going to be a really good separation between my main element and the skin outside of it. It's acting as a barrier. It's holding everything together for me, and it's unifying my entire piece. Now the other option here would also be to go through and add lines around each individual petal. This isn't typically a style that I go for in my designs, but if you wanted to avoid doing all of this pushing and pulling the contrast with the shadows and highlights, then you could just go through and put a nice line around everything. Let's actually go back to our original rows. So this is our original rows before we did anything to it last example. And let's say I don't want to go through, I don't want to push and pull all the values. I just want to create a nice edge so that I can get away with maybe using only my midtones. If I don't necessarily want to have a lot of blacks in my design, this would be a viable solution. So there you have it. We've created a really strong, distinguishable edge or separation between our canvas or the skin and our actual design. And look, we've done that without really using a whole lot of contrast. Now, my recommendation would be to go through, regardless of whether you're putting lines on your work or not, go through and apply contrast. Apply the values, the darks, the lights, push and pull, have some fun with that, because it really does make things look more dynamic. But if we're talking purely from a longevity standpoint, not necessarily an aesthetics standpoint, this is a very easy, very viable way to make sure that things are going to stand up well over time. And look, we've got nice distinguished leaves. We can tell easily what all the petals are, where all the petals are. It's really clear, it's easy to understand. And the benefit is that our lines, they're black. They're the darkest value on our value scale. So they're gonna be something that the body really has a hard time breaking down. Let's look at one more example here. Let's say that our client comes in with a picture of her mom. Pretend that this is her mom. Must be a young client, maybe too young to be tattooed. In either case, your client wants to get this portrait tattooed on them. Now, I've already gone through and I've already added the darker and lighter contrast for us to make it easier. So this is what it's gonna look like. All I've done is I've added my contrast here on a new layer. And what I wanna do is I wanna take a look at the edges here. Some of these edges where they're already pretty dark, this stuff's all right. This stuff's all right. It's gonna hold up decent enough because we have a nice contrast between the skin and the actual subject matter, especially around here. When we're getting to the hair, it's nice and dark. So I have a really nice dark edge framing everything in for me. Now the problem areas are gonna be around here where it's really light. What am I gonna do with all of this stuff? And where we're working with a portrait, maybe we don't want to go through and apply a really strong line around the outside because that's not really realistic. If you're talking pure realism, you're not going to see thick, bold lines around subject matter in the real world. So why would we do it in our designs? There's another solution here. And in the real world, what you're actually going to see is backgrounds. You're going to see a background on anything. If you look at anything outside, in nature, in public, you're going to see your subject matter, and then you're going to see a background behind it. So what we can easily do is go through and start to create a darker background. Just something to anchor everything in, frame in the face, and give us the opportunity to actually create lighter edges on the face without worrying about putting a nice thick line on everything. So I'm just going through, and I'm gonna do it on the other side just so that it matches. That's just my preference here. It's not totally necessary. And you can see how it actually, when I put my black values in behind the subject matter, look how much lighter my line actually looks than it did before. Interesting, eh? So I'm just going through, just creating some contrast here, framing stuff in, and I'm just gonna do a little bit down to the bottom, just to hold that in place. Now you could make this more of a fun background. You could do some cool stuff. I don't know what you might want to do, but I like this kind of, it just looks like a charcoal drawing, a charcoal background. That's all I see. And if I was tattooing this, I would just use a big shader and I would just shade in the background a little bit. Maybe it looks a little bit too dark for me right now. So you can see I can even lighten it up quite a bit and still get away with the effect that I need. I think I'll maybe do something like this. Oops. And I often like to just, do a little bit of a decoration or some dots or just something around there. I don't know if that actually looks that good right now. But anyways, you get the idea. We're just using a really simple background in order to lift the face up off of the skin. I'm creating separation from the skin. I'm creating contrast, and I'm creating an edge, most importantly. An edge around the perimeters of the face that's going to allow it to hold up quite a bit better, and it's going to be much easier to see on the person's skin.